All right, guys, welcome back to the Adam 50 Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have Chris Perez. Chris is an 83 kilo lifter, and he just competed at Powerlifting American Nationals and had his best meet to date, getting a 650 pound squat or 295 kilo squat, a 202.5 kilo bench, 446 pounds, and then I believe that's 327.5 slash 7.7, or is that 330? On deadlift. His
330,
seven
yeah.
point five, 330. Yeah, so
Yeah.
he's ridiculously strong. Got like a 559 dots this last one. And like looking over your open powerlifting, like you're like always like rather strong. He's such like your very, very first meet back in 2016, but you've been doing this for about 8 years. So like what got you into the sport? And 'cause I always think it's interesting seeing like why people start it.
Yeah, for sure. So I started, um, I think 2014 or something. I started going to the gym and just doing like regular bodybuilding stuff. I had watched Pumping Iron, so like back then, and that was like that inspired me. Like I can see I have an Arnold picture right there. So watching that, I was like, at first I thought I wanted to be a bodybuilder, and then just transitioned to other things. I did football for like a season in high school, and I did track for like a season, and then I did CrossFit for like a year, and then I got hurt a couple times doing CrossFit. And just in doing CrossFit, I was like, during that period of time when I was hurt, I was like, I'm gonna start to train to like get stronger because I can do this, and then eventually I go back to CrossFit. But I ended up being better at lifting weights, and I just liked it more. So I joined my university's powerlifting team, and that was kind of where it started.
Right on. So as far as like like as you like progress as a power lifter, like obviously starting at like that collegiate level, like what do you think have been like the biggest things that have really allowed you to continually make consistent progress? Because like you're looking over your open powerlifting, it's just been like consistently upwards with your dot score, which is like not common. Usually you'll see like some ups and downs.
Hmm. I think I've always had like relatively good training. I've been relatively injury free, except for you'll see there's a span of time for like 2 years on my open powerlifting where I didn't compete because I had two back injuries. So for like 2 years, from like 2017 to 2019, I was like not even training basically. I basically was out of it for like 2 years. But since that injury and kind of getting better from that, I've been pretty much injury free. I've been able to maintain that, and I think I just train relatively conservatively. Like if you just look at my training, if you follow my like what I do, it's like I almost never do like I never go really, really heavy. I do sometimes, but I just stay healthy. You know what I mean? Like I'm not pushing beyond what I should be doing. I kind of undershoot a lot of stuff. I think that's something I preach to like my lifters and other people that ask me for advice. I'm like, you just probably need to be more conservative. Like you're probably gonna you can probably get most of the benefits while keeping away from like the injuries, the extra fatigue, all that stuff, if you just stay just slightly under, a little less aggressive.
I think especially as a cross like a powerlifting career, like doing those like really heavy sets like RP9 plus, really just beat you up even more. Because I remember I started off and like I had no conception of what RPE was. I was a total meathead, and like I still
Mm-hmm.
trained squat, bench, and deadlift. It was mostly just bodybuilding. But I would just go and do like I like a 5-3-1 like across like 3 weeks, and I would just do that and
Yeah.
then like just max out all the time. And I got and that was fine. It was like I wasn't super strong as I got stronger, and then as I had more time learning with the barbell, like I've had more issues with like recovery. I also think like something interesting with like technique is that like while it might not like have issues like early on because you're so new to it, like some more techniques can be like, oh well, long term, this might lead to some more aches and pains. I'm just saying like some max in general, like I think it's hard to like get that buy-in sometimes from lifters, but
Mm-hmm.
I think like especially as you just feel better in training, like that's really important. It's something that kind of want to talk about, like that whole training enjoyments. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that one of the biggest things is like you see a lot of coaches or athletes that try to have this as fast as possible results. And I think that's, I think, in today's modern powerlifting climate with how fast everybody is progressing, you do need to have that. But I also think like we also need to think about sustainability. As you said there, one of the biggest things for you has been you haven't gotten hurt. So as far as like, having that enjoyment of training and then like preventing that burnout, what do you think are like the biggest things that like you've done and maybe some things that you have your lifters do?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it also depends what kind of lifter you are, how much you're willing to sacrifice the enjoyment part of it. I've always, for the most part, enjoyed training. It's just always been a part of my life. I've always, whatever I did at the time, whatever sport I played, I always just enjoyed training. So I've definitely had my ups and downs, I guess, over the years, but for the most part, I've always enjoyed it, and that's kept me in it. And then I also have my goals, like I have things I want to achieve, so that's also been a big part of it for me. But I think when you're not at the highest level, like you have to enjoy it even more because it's like your goals are just very personal. It's not like you're not really competing necessarily against other super high level people. Um, so that's a conversation I have with my lifters sometimes. Like how much of this is like is how much of it is the importance of like getting as strong as possible, or how much of it is like do you want to enjoy this? Because those training programs might look slightly different. You might be willing to give someone more variation, more a little more fun stuff that I think is maybe not going to be as optimal. Um, if they place more priority on like enjoying their training and having fun doing it. Um, so I mean, I think part of it is like figuring out where you are and like kind of what your goals are.
Yeah, I think that's a good point because if you are trying to be the best, there's going to be just some things that you're going to have to do, and sometimes like there are going to be some periods of training where you have to work through those higher amounts of fatigue. And honestly, I feel like too, like if you have those really like aggressive goals, high level goals like you and I do, like we're more willing to do those things and like do less things that we enjoy. That means that well, I don't really care if I don't like Bulgarian split squats if my squat goes up. I don't really care
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
do like an extra set if my if this goes up. And then also like part of that also comes down to like because like my psychology, for example, is like I like pushing really hard, and like I just had to realize like for me it's like I have to pull back a little bit more and stay a little bit more sub max more in order to
Hmm.
not get hurt and feel better and be able to stack up win after win after win. At that same token, though, I do think like you wouldn't train if you didn't like it, So
Of
I
course.
think
Yeah.
there's obviously like you probably have like the masochistic thing, or like you kind of like that oh god, like I have an RPE 8 to 9, top set today.
Yeah. I've definitely, for the most part, I've always enjoyed it. I've had a few times over the years where I've had some burnout, but for me, it's like the most fun is when I'm getting better, obviously, like when I'm making progress. So for me, it's like whatever the program looks like, I'm kind of okay with it as long as I can see that it's getting me to where I need to get to, right? Like I don't always enjoy everything that I do, but I know that I know that what I'm doing is going to get me to my end result. So I'm kind of okay with it.
I think one of the things too is like I know you're coached by Marcellus. I think he does a really good job like communicating like why you're doing what you're doing, and it helps like bleed into like that long term plan. Because I think that's a big responsibility of coaches is to like tell the athletes like this is why you're doing it. This is my expectation for this block. This is how it sets yourself up for the next block because some blocks are just like you're just trying to like rebuild a base. If there's a PR, cool. This other blocks like we're really trying to like push here a little bit more or whatever. And I think that like the powerlifters, like even if you're like, some athletes are going to be like, I want to just lift the weights and get stronger, but like I think it's important for them to know like this is why you're not doing as heavy of a top set or whatever right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And Marcellus does do a really good job of that. We talk a lot about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And like immediately after nationals, which I just did like 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago, we like laid out the next 5 months of training. Like I know at least in theory like what each block should kind of look like and kind of what the structure is going to be. I know when I'm pushing and when I'm not pushing leading up to my next meet. So I also do that with my lifters. I tell them like, okay, this block we're gonna pull back a little bit so that next block we can really shine and like kind of go crazy on the next block or whatever. Or I tell them, we're gonna pull back here, we're gonna push a little harder here, and then we're really gonna go crazy on this last one. And I want them to know that because I think sometimes they think that like the end of the block is like the end of like everything, and they're like, I have to go heavy because it's the end of the block. I got to do it now. But it's like if you do that now, you may not feel as good the next block when I really wanted you to like have that peak performance or whatever.
Yeah, because training is all about stacking wins and having training with momentum because like you can max out at the end of your blocks, but it's like how does that affect the next block? Like how fatigued do you really feel, and how does that affect where you could be at the end of your next block? Something that Eric Bodhorn does with like me is like he's a little more biased for like block periodization. And so like I am very like distinct volume phases versus more submax and intensification and peaking phases. And like for my psychology and just how my body like typically feels, I feel pretty crummy when I go down to like lower intensity. Like for me, it's like, okay, cool. This is like why we're staying with that higher volume, doing like more rep PRs, my body feels a little bit better. And then like I can kind of know like long term, well, this is like what it's going to bleed into, and I'll be better. I think one of the things for you too is like you probably have enough training data where you can like, like what we did with Marcellus is look and say like, if I nail all my variables, this is around where every single block should end up. This is how it bleeds into everything. Because powerlifting right now is, it's less unregulated in my opinion than really ever. Like there still is that key point, but like the best lifters plan their progressions backwards, and they know where they're going to end up and how they're going to set themselves up for that PR. And I think that also helps lifters stay a little bit more submaximal, because sometimes it's like if you don't really understand RPs, that's so like subjective. Like you can just train too heavy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I think momentum is huge, like block to block. And I think RP is just one tool that you can use. I find myself more and more giving people like percentages and percentage ranges, regardless of even the RP sometimes, because I might say like RP6, but what would be a true RP6 for that person may be more stimulus than they perhaps need on that day. Maybe it bleeds into the next, the primary day or whatever. So I find myself like Marcellus gives me ranges, for example, on my primary days. Like, do I absolutely need that? No, like I know what an RP8 is or whatever, but it helps me to kind of stay on track, right? And I find that I've been doing that more with my lifters because I want to make sure that they're getting the right stimulus at the right time.
Right. I really like the concept of like we're just trying to set ourselves up for like the next week of progression in our block, and based on how you're trying to peak, you can plan things out like that. It's really interesting, like talking about like how like some things can like bleed into sessions. It's like sometimes it can be like too much volume, but most of the time I find it's just too much intensity, because in my opinion, like that's the number one thing that is probably different between powerlifting programs, like how some active they stay or like their peak intensity exposure. Because some people do respond really well to intensity, but they don't respond rather poorly to volume. Other people, you just give them volume and they just suck it up. And I would argue that I think like, the meta is like more some matches. I think more people can adapt and recover from that. Kind of like what you said. So regarding like peak intensity exposure in training, um, what have you found to work like best for yourself and most of the people that you work with? Because I think that it's important for us to have that, it's important to maintain training momentum, but it's also really important to practice that skill of lifting like a heavy ass weight. So how would you, go about that?
Yeah, so I think there's like a few different structures that are like the average structure that I think works best for my lifters. So like a pretty common one is like I'll have like a 12-week macro cycle, for example, and I'll have like a block of triples, and I might end anywhere between at 8 to 9 on the primary days, obviously, depending on the lifter, right? If they need that extra intensity, if they're for whatever reason, like I might go up to a 9 that block, but for most people, I'm between an 8.5, 8 to 8.5. So they'll have like a block of triples, block of doubles around a similar intensity, around 8 to 8.5 RP. And then we might have that third block, which would be the block of singles. And that one we usually go to like a 9. So that one is like I tell them, if you have a PR, like we should take it on this block. So that's kind of like an average structure that I would use for my lifters, just like a general structure. Um, for me, my training approach has changed a little bit because I've in the past I used to have these really long, like 8-week blocks, like literally just building up for 8 weeks. So I would start like I would plan way out ahead of time, like what I want to hit at the end of the block, and then I would have, I'd go up 5 kilos a week, basically. Like that's what I would do for the whole block, and it worked for a long time. But I don't think that's ideal for the majority of people. And when I started working with Marcellus, we tried more a 4-week block, which is just a more normal, structure block length, taking bigger jumps. And so now I find that I can go heavier more often, but I'm still not like maxing out every block. I might have like a push block and then a block that I kind of pull back on. So that's kind of like for me, it's kind of how the structure is, like one heavier block and one slightly lighter block.
I like that because I think that really gives you yourself like it's like creating that base and then push in that next level. If you're constantly pushing all the time, like your body is gonna, kind of be like, no, like we can't keep doing this. Like that was actually the thing that went wrong during my peak for this last meet was I just pushed too hard, and you absolutely can regress if you don't pull back enough. It's like it's not like
Yeah.
a true strength loss. It's important to like communicate to athletes in those periods of time. Like a lot of it is just you're just really like fatigue relative to your fitness levels right now. You gotta get that down. But I think that pulling and pushing is like really smart. To like tell athletes. And I do think like 8 to 8.5. Like Eric Bodorn, like my coach, he doesn't really like really going above that. on like a squat or deadlift. And like
Mhm.
his argument with like even in like peaking, and his like argument is like, well, I feel like it's close enough to like a 10 without getting like the actual fatigue from a 10. And I think that especially as he gets
Yeah.
stronger, I think that becomes like even more true because you're squatting a ton of weight and like every single like that actual objective load goes up like 500 pounds is still 500 pounds on squat. It still is going to be more stressful than a 300 pounds on
Mhm.
squat. And I think that's especially as you get more and more advanced, you will see, plus your John Hack, that, people don't really touch heavy weights very often because like if you're deadlifting 700 plus pounds, it's so much more fatigue on your body.
Yeah. I find that like most people can only have so many peak exposures like within a certain period of time before they start to kind of like drop off pretty hard. So if I have them do it every single block, or like if I do it every single block, I just won't feel as good when I'm trying to feel good. Versus like I kind of cap myself at a certain load this first block, knowing that it's gonna set me up better for the next one. So I found a lot of success with my lifters and with myself as well. And then I think the other thing is that um, lost my train of thought there. It was gonna be about the okay, that's right. Okay, so about the RPE. So the reason that I also will cap someone at like an 8 to 8.5 or something also is because when I give people a 9, it almost always becomes a 10.
10. Yep.
So that's another thing that I'm even guilty of that. Like when it's a 9, it's like it's gonna be a 10. Like as much as I have experience and I know what I should do, it just kind of ends up being like that sometimes. So if I give them the 8 to 8.5, I'm giving a little bit of extra room for error. So like if it maybe it ends up actually being a 9, but it's not gonna be a 10, hopefully, you know?
Yeah, I still think it's like I think it's still I'd rather have the athlete that like wants to go that like heavier in powerlifting than like the athlete's like scared of like the bar. I'm like, you gotta load the
Yeah,
bar to get stronger, please.
yeah,
And that's something that I think is and one of the things I've always had to tell, especially like newer clients, is like it's supposed to feel heavy. And like even I like need somebody yeah, you're peaked right now, hopefully, your coach didn't mess up, but it's still gonna feel heavy. Like 90% is still around 90%. And a 99% single is still 99%. Like it's still really, really heavy. And so
yeah,
really just, being okay with that and trusting your technique and like doing the hard rep. I love that cue by like David Wilson, just like do the hard rep and man up and like trust your techniques. You'll see all the time with lifters, like when the bar gets heavy or they are maxed out, they'll like randomly like change their foot position or like how they're gripping the barbell or like how they're arching or whatever. And you have to
yeah.
just trust your training and just remind yourself like you got strong in that movement pattern for over months at a time. You don't want to change things and just accepting that's going to be hard. Like that's the sport.
Yeah, that is a big thing, that point that you made about technique, because I do have a lot of younger lifters that are constantly wanting to experiment with new things, and I'm like, this is working. Why do you want to change this? Like you're this is a safe technique. It's efficient. It's sustainable. Just keep doing it. Like you're getting stronger this way, so don't change it. So that's a good like that is something that I find. Um, and then to comment on your other thing, I personally have not had that many lifters where I have to push them. Like I almost always have to pull people back because they just always want to go heavier. And I think that's just inherently like a thing that like powerlifters are attracted, the type of people that are going to powerlift are going to be like that. Like they want to go heavy. That's probably why they started powerlifting. So I personally find that I'm pulling people back all the time, because they'll just go way too heavy all the time or they'll push too hard on the secondaries. Um, so that's kind of like one of the biggest struggles as a coach, I feel like, is like finding the right balance, and then also sometimes giving them the reins to like go for it because you can't just always pull everyone back.
Yeah, well, like what you said, I think that's like why like getting them like ranges and like whatnot, like along with like an RPE is really important because it's like, well, even if I feel really good, like I'm not going to go above this range. It like prevents like that true overshoot, especially like to keep like things like you said like an 8.5. If your range is like 2% above or 3% above, it's not going to be an all out max, which is kind of what we want to avoid. Um, so I wanted to ask you then, in general, like in terms of like powerlifting off seasons, people have different opinions on this because there's one of two structures that people like to incorporate. Usually, is like a DUP, which is going to be I think every training week has that, but I think that DUP like in terms of periodization is meaningfully different from like a block structure. And some people also use it as like let's just do like a bodybuilding phase, like a muscle growth phase. And I have my own issues with that. But
Mm-hmm.
in terms of like off season training, say you have 6+ months where you don't have a meet and plan, like how do you think is the best way to really lifters to set themselves up for, say the goals of off season typically are going to be let's, get more jack first off, and then how do we also do that while not compromising our strength gain?
Yeah, so I find that like off seasons for me are not very different from in season training for the most part. It's very similar. You might put a little more emphasis on the accessories, like pushing them a little bit harder when you're like way farther out. Um, if you have a range of like effective reps that works for each particular lift, each particular day, maybe you're at the higher end for a little bit. So like if okay, I do really well when I do between sixes and eights on squat. Like you might spend some time doing eights, for example, and then it's just slowly kind of bringing it down, like tapering it down as you get closer to the meet. But um, overall, I find that like off seasons are very, very similar. I don't really change the structure too much for people. Um, the thing that's unique about an off season that is sometimes helpful is that it gives us an opportunity to try things that we wanted to try like in prep that we weren't able to because we didn't want to change things too much. So like if there's a variation that I think could have worked really well for someone because let's say they have a technical error or technical flaw that they do, and I think this variation is going to help that. I'm more willing to try it in the off season because I think we have plenty of time that even if it doesn't work out, we can kind of just go back to what was working better before, for example.
Yeah, I like that concept of like really just experimenting because like, there's like not a big cost and maybe, sometimes you might even find something that works. Like I've had it several times, like I've actually like reduced down like frequency on like something and I'm like, they are
Mm-hmm.
actually like responding a little bit better to that. And actually like you say like for bench day instead of comp bench, it's like we're doing like incline barbell, we're doing flat dumbbell, or like a machine chest press and like their primary gears are showing up better. I do agree with you too, is like, in regards to like off season, like I think a lot of times lifters when they're coming to you and they're like, I also like, I like the hypertrophy block. What they're saying is like, I feel centrally fatigued. I'm scared of singles. Please give me
Yeah,
a break.
yeah,
So like I like call it like I call it like a low neural stress block. Like post meet is like if they're doing that, like I don't like not like a high like neural stress block because like peaking is tough for a lot of people. I think that's one of the things that's also like really hard to manage. Is like, and I'm powerlifting now. Mike Teixeira was saying like how he thinks it's strange that people can't respond as well to like singles or whatever. Like nowadays, like what I have noticed with like a lot of powerlifters, like the singles year round approach is less valid for a lot of athletes. Um, have you noticed that like with yourself for people like my whole thing is I feel like most people need like more variation because like we do know that periodization does matter a lot for strength gains. Like one way I have seen like, and I talked to Eric Helms about this, like one of my podcasts a while ago was like, he like periodizing like the intensity on singles and that's how he like does it.
mm-hmm.
But like, do you think there's something like to singles and like peaking that's like really hard for people? Like, it's like one of the things I guess like what I'm getting at is like, we want to manage fatigue. We've talked about that a lot, but sometimes people have to go to high levels of fatigue to make progress. It's kind of like inevitable. Is that like a bad thing? Is that something we should be like avoiding? Like how should we like bring in the concept of like fatigue and particularly like like around peaking or hard periods of training?
Yeah. I think that's an individual thing. I think it just depends on the person. I do agree that like I'm not a fan of doing singles all year round. I think at one point I was, and I've done singles pretty much most of my career, and now more recently when I've been with Marcellus, we've started to go away from that a little bit, and it seems to be working. Um, and it's something that I've started to go away from as much with my own lifters too. For the reason of one of the reasons is like managing fatigue, and one of the reasons is to periodize the training a little bit. I feel like if you do singles all year round, you're going to run into a wall at some point where you can no longer progress those singles. And then like, what do you do? Do you just start over and then at a lighter point? I mean, you could, right? Like you could just cap the singles at a certain point, have a lighter block of singles and then a heavier block of singles. Um, but like you said, like, I don't think you have to spend all year round doing them. And that's where like the triples and doubles come into place. Because you can push triples and the load on the bar is going to be lighter than what it is for doubles or singles, right? And I find that it also helps to build momentum block to block. Because like, let's say you're you're a 600-pound squatter, you might work up to 540 or 550 for a triple, and then the next block you might work up to 560 or 570 for a double, and then you might work up to 600. So the absolute load in the bar is lighter, right? So you're kind of building momentum block to block. Um, and I imagine that I just think when people see singles, they just want to push harder. That's just my experience too. Like when you see that single, you're just like, it's hard to not max out that single, unless you like have a percentage and you're capped or something.
Mm-hmm. I also think one other thing to that is I think we forget a lot of times as powerlifters like how much stress fracture between like our connective tissues, and like the heavier that we're going, like they never like really get a break, and like that remodeling is like slower. And so I think that like that's also one of like the benefits of like having that structure, having like different like rep ranges to work through. Also, just it's like more fun because like if you're always doing like single, is like you can have like a variation in your strength that's like, oh crap, like I got worse this block. When you actually probably didn't, you just were tired, or something went wrong, or like it just went stale. And a lot of times it just
Yeah.
comes down to like periodizing things for the athlete. Like I know that Marcellus likes that 3-2-1. Like I've tried that in the past, and like for myself, like my body just feels so much better doing like 4-6. It's just really strange. That's where I see like all
Mhm.
my progress. And like I've really had so many periods of training where it's like I can come to the gym and be like, I feel really good. Do like a random single from that, and it moves great. I'm not supposed to do that. Don't tell my coach. But
Yeah.
like, that's just like what I've noticed. But like I also think like as you get more advanced, like you kind of have that skill of grinding or that skill of singles. Like if you've done a lot of that heavier training, that's actually one of the things I do with more my beginners. Though, is I'm more okay with giving them the singles because like more frequently, because they're getting such rapid technique improvements, such rapid neurological improvements. It's really motivating for them, and they tend to be a
Mhm.
little bit more like robust. And I actually don't like really periodize like their intensity too much, like because I really think the really big part about like beginner powerlifters is like learn how to push your accessories and learn how to train hard. And fatigue management is less of a thing. Like I won't like progress my secondary days as much. Might be like just like at 7 to 8 the entire block. But it's like a linear like periodization downwards. Because like that's what the research I've gathered is like best like 5-4-3-2-1 or something like that. We just like do that over and over and over again. Because like they're making such rapid improvements. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like if you're a beginner lifter, it also makes sense maybe to keep singles more often because you just don't have a history of practicing them. You don't have that neural, like that pattern is not ingrained in you to like push a hard single. So you might want to give a newer lifter singles more often over someone who's been doing it for years and like knows how to do a single. And I think the
mhm.
mental component is also a big part of it because like I'll just use myself as an example. Like when I have a heavy single, it my brain works differently for that heavy single versus like I just PR'd my squat triple like a couple days ago, right? But there wasn't that like mental like the stress wasn't really there because it's a weight that I know that I can do for us like I've done it many times for singles. So like it's not as scary to take that for a triple versus like adding 20 or 30 kilos on top of that for a single. And I think the mental component also plays part of it. Like I just think the single is always, in my opinion, like scarier than a double or a triple.
Yeah, especially like if you're like, like just like seeing like more weight on the bar than like you're
Yeah,
used to. Like if I see 6 reps on like a bar, I'm like, oh my God, like I've hit that maybe like 4 times in my life, like
yeah,
plus. So it's like I don't know. When like 5 reps, like whatever. Like I've done this like several times. It's not like a big deal. I do think that's actually probably a big part of like the fatigue component too, because I know Brian Miner talks about like how there's a lot of been like big mental component like that fatigue of like heavier intensities. And I think that's a large part of like why people are like, oh my God, like I'm so stressed about like this heavy weight I have to lift the next session and the next session. And it's like, it's nice to have that a break. So I want to ask you too, like, how often do you think that, you should compete? Because I think there's some people that think you should compete like all the time. There's other people that are like, like let's not compete until like we've gotten stronger. Like, what's your opinion with that? Like, do you think there's even like a point to competing if you haven't like really made improvements?
um, yeah. I think I've always been in the camp of like twice a year is pretty ideal for most people. You made a good point that like maybe if you haven't gotten stronger in a while, maybe you take more time to like really dial in the formula, really dial in the structure, like actually see like real progress before you maybe sign up for a meet or something. I think that's a valid point. I think that for the majority of people, twice a year is pretty ideal. It gives you like, you know, 5, 6, 7 months between meets if you're trying to space them out. Plenty of time for like an off season, plenty of time to try out the stuff that maybe you wanted to try that you couldn't try because you were at meet prep. Um, I think there's also like I will say like if you're a newer lifter and you're getting stronger like constantly, like every block you're hitting PRs, you can probably compete more often um, for the platform experience, and then you just know you're going to hit PRs every time because you're just getting stronger and stronger. Or in the case where you're like maybe not a beginner lifter, but you're someone who has a lot of anxiety around competing. Maybe you're a higher level lifter and you're competing at big meets and stuff, and you want to get more experience, more practice, more time having a judge like tell you when to lift and stuff. So I think it can be valuable to compete more often. I would just recommend that people don't don't push or peak every single time if they're going to do it more than a couple times a year. Because I think it is tough to, first of all, I think you lose momentum because when you're having to peak, you end up having to drop your volume and taper and stuff. And sometimes it's a little harder to get back into training. Um, but yeah, that's another thing. It's like another it depends kind of thing. I would say on average twice a year is probably solid for most people. Um, but yeah, like you said, if you've gone a long period of time without seeing any progress, I would probably prioritize figuring out training first before trying to jump into a meet.
Yeah, I think that like it all like what we said, it all depends. I think twice a year is a good starting spot, but I think that also comes down to like do you feel like excited to come to like to compete? Is it something that you're really excited to do? How good are you at competing too? Like some like what you said, like some people just suck at competing. They're not very good, and they need to figure out that skill. Whereas like not to do my own horn, but like I've had really damn good meets. Like my worst meet was because it was a 100-degree meet outside, and then like I was cramping on my bench press and my deadlift, and that's why I
Mm-hmm.
only missed them. But yeah, I think that's just like an important thing to like consider. I also think like training is where you make that progress, and you do have to like remind yourself that whenever you do taper, you are losing momentum, and it can make it a little bit more difficult to back in training, like what you said. Depending like how heavy that you actually did go. Um, so as far as competition specificity, how much variation do you like to incorporate in your program for lifters versus like the actual competition lift volume? Um, Especially like I know that you're probably using like a more of a submaximal program. And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think like the volume is like the exact same for like an RPE 5 like set of like complex versus like an RPE like 9 accessory. So like how do you try to like manage the balance between that for your lifters?
Yeah, so for like the barbell movements, I'm usually going to bias towards the competition lift more often if I can. Um, but it's another it depends type of thing where like I think most people are going to need some variation in their training. Like they're not going to only be able to do competition lifts. And I think it's also like lift dependent as well. Like I think, for example, most people are benching at least 3 times a week, I would say, probably more. So because you're doing the lift more frequently, I think there's a little more room to like have variations in there and still, and it still kind of moves the needle for you. Um, but it just highly depends on the person, right? Like I usually don't bring in variations without a reason for it. So if I switch a competition lift for a variation, it's because I think there's something that's going to provide, right, outside of just the variation itself. So maybe you have someone that, let's say for deadlift, like they have issues off the floor, their positioning is bad, or they're having issues at lockout, and you think it's stemming from something they're doing right off the floor. Then like a pause deadlift can be great for that, right? Because it helps you, it kind of forces you to be patient, it forces you to work right off the floor. So that can be useful for that individual, right? And I kind of apply the same thing for all the lifts. If I have someone who just like cannot pause. Like I'm having them like I'm like, hey, you're not pausing long enough. On bench, for example, I may give them like a long pause on purpose to make them train that skill, right? And sometimes I even have on their competition day, right, where they would normally do like their heaviest single of the week or whatever. I might give them a 2 count or a 3 count if they really cannot get it down. I really just want them to do a competition pause. But if I tell them competition pause, it's going to be a touch and go pause. So I might give them a 2 or 3 count to force them to have somewhat of a pause there. So yeah, I do use variations. Probably every lifter I have has some variation, but I'm usually going to bias towards the competition lift most of the time.
Mm-hmm. I think one other like consideration there is too is like if it keeps them like healthier, because sometimes like like for myself, like for example, like I have really terrible shoulder movement mobility. I'm working on that, but like my squatting kind of like beats me up. Like even though I do like high bar, my shoulder
Yeah.
external rotation is terrible. But it helps keep me a little more I feel better if I'm doing a safety bar like once a week.
Hmm.
Also, like my back is a big strength in my squat, and like I might also notice like one was like Eric and I like a period of time like I took them out for like a long time. I was like, why am I getting tipped over on squat all the time now? Like, and I was like, oh, like for some reason, like that, the safety bar squats just really help with my back extensor strength. I think that's a big one too. I do agree with you. Like in general, like you want to find like what's their cap of like the competition like specificity they can actually recover from and tolerate, and then you sprinkle in variations as needed to improve technique or keep them healthy. And as far as like accessory work goes, do you tend to give your athletes a lot of accessory work, or are you sort of like, more of like a minimalist and like mostly going towards like, like that strength training is like, for example, like I know like reactive training system doesn't really give their athletes a lot of accessories. You don't really need a lot of accessories to get strong. But in the long term, like you want to get like really jacked, like you might have to. It's like for you, like you're like what like around like the top of like your weight class. Like, are you still doing as many like accessories as maybe like more like a beginner would?
Yeah. So I walk around 2 kilos or less over the weight class. So I don't really cut very much. It's a really easy, like smooth cut for me for the most part. Um, but yeah, I think that my approach to accessories hasn't really changed that much. I do think that like when you're a newer lifter, you might have to put a little more emphasis on them because that's the biggest weakness or the biggest bottleneck at that point is like you just need to get bigger and stronger. So I might encourage them like to push their accessories a little more. I might give them a little more accessory work, but I'm also pushing my accessory work like a decent amount. That's something that I've always kind of struggled with. I've always sandbagged my accessories a good amount, so I've tried to get better and better at pushing them. But I think the logic applies wherever you are, right? If you're a younger lifter that needs to get bigger, then you need to push your accessories. If you're already at the top of your weight class, I don't think it hurts to have more muscle mass or to try to recomp in some way, right? Like I know that I could recomp, like I could lose some fat and gain some muscle, and it would help me for sure, you know. So yeah, I would say in terms of accessories, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I don't really give a ton of accessory work. I've definitely had some people come to me and be like, "Hey, this doesn't seem like a lot of accessory work," and it's just because I think if you're pushing it appropriately to the actual RP that I'm giving you, you may not be able to recover from too much more than that. So on
Absolutely.
somebody that, yeah, so somebody who's training like, let's say 5 days a week, just like an average, they might have, you know, 2 to 3 accessory movements per day. So it ends up being 10 to 15 exercises, let's say 3 sets of each. And I do periodize it and I do increase the RPE week to week. So at the end, like you're getting to these, 8 to 9 RPE sets that if you're really doing that, I think that's probably enough for most people.
Yeah, I think that's like a big thing is like with my program, I don't do like a lot of accessory volume. Like I only do like a couple sets like for like accessory that I do, like I'll do like drop sets and like mile reps and like that and like
Mhm.
sort of as like a shit test for me. Is like am I just stopping as like I'm being a baby? And I get that to a lot of my clients. I think that like pushing your accessories like is like powerlifting training is like different than like the bodybuilding training. Like bodybuilders do a really good job like killing themselves in the gym and just really going hard. And the powerlifters like we're still going hard, but it's more like that controlled rage is like kind of what I say it is. But yeah, I agree with you. I think it's an interesting thing with like the recomp conversation there because like I feel like as it's about being like as lean as you can be before you start noticing that like you feel like crap and you're like not recovering well, and you're always hungry and like you have like more aches and pains. I think that really just depends on the lifter, but like all else being equal, like I think this just comes down to like actually managing your nutrition and knowing how to properly eat. That's like probably the biggest thing powerlifters can learn from bodybuilders is how to actually periodize their nutrition and how to properly eat. And there's a lot of powerlifters like just eat like two meals a day and are concerned and like wonder like why they aren't like recovering very well, like, how aren't doing or like aren't like recomping. It's like a lot of times I'll have clients like come to me, I change nothing with their calories, but we just change like some of the application is like people that say like for example like post workout timing that doesn't matter. I'm like yes it does. Like especially if you're more advanced, like that's for recomp because your muscle protein synthesis is elevated highest to training. So it's you eat more closer to training after that window, and you're probably gonna make more gains.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, but I'm actually terrible when it comes to my nutrition. I'm pretty bad. Like you kind of described a lot of things that I do. Like I eat like 2 meals a day usually, and like
Well, like but Chris,
I've
I
had
hear that you're already this elite. Imagine like you be 600 dots like
yeah,
with your
I've had
nutrition.
I've had these conversations with people over the years and stuff. Yeah, I'm just terrible with it. It's I don't know exactly why it is. I've always eaten kind of bad. Like I eat fast food and stuff, and like I definitely do not eat enough protein. Like I've tracked for weeks at a time, and I'm just not getting there. Um, but yeah, it's just a stress for me. I don't know why. It's so weird. Like I'm just so used to doing what I do that when I go outside of it too much, and I love to eat, so when I go outside of it too much, it becomes more of a stress than I think it's helping me. Um, so I'm terrible when it comes to nutrition. I probably eat worse than a lot of my clients, to be honest.
Well, I think like with that, like you're at least eating enough, and I think that's like the most important thing with
Yeah.
powerlifting is like we're talking, and Pete Rubish even like talked about this. It's like he like found like for himself just like am I eating in enough calories? Like that's number one for powerlifting, and then like protein and like
Hmm.
food quality is like all after that. But it definitely like can make like a decent difference. But that's kind of I will hear that a lot of times, but like it's kind of exciting for you, like saying like, well, as soon as I'm like ready to like maybe I'm not making as much progress as I would like. Well, maybe this is like the bottleneck. I need to
Yeah.
start addressing. I actually think that like from like a sustainability perspective, like going back to what we were talking about before, that's just more fun for you. You're going to keep working doing this until it doesn't work, and then you might take it more seriously. But you're going to be more like, okay, I want this, but I know this is the bottleneck right now. So you're doing like everything like all at once, and like as a coach, that's the mistake I made sometimes, like saying like, come on, my clients, you have to do all these things like right the hell now, or else, and like that can just overwhelm them and burn them out.
Yeah. And I've definitely done better over the last couple years or so. I used to work with Sean Noriega, and he's really big into food and food quality and stuff like that. And so he was always like on me about that. And so I started to make changes, and I am better than I used to be, but it's not what you would expect, right? It's a little bit embarrassing sometimes, but I know that at some point that might be something that I kind of delve into. I think leading into last year's nationals, I did dial in a lot of my stuff, my nutrition. I was getting like 200 grams of protein a day. I was doing pretty good for like a couple months, and then right after nationals, I just like dropped back off, and I was like, I'm just gonna go back to what I enjoy doing.
Right. Well, again, like I said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it yet.
Yeah,
Um, Chris, I want to thank you so much for coming on. If you want to follow you or hire you for coaching, where should they head?
sure. So Instagram at Chris Perez PL. They can send me a DM there, or they can send me an email, chrispereztraining@gmail.com.
Cool. Well, I'll make sure I include that information in the show notes. And thank you guys for listening. Talk to you guys in the next episode.